The house on Oakwood Avenue stood at the end of a quiet, well-kept street. The neighborhood was a picture of suburban tranquility, where neatly trimmed lawns met white picket fences and children played in the yards, the sounds of laughter mixing with the chirping of birds. It looked like a place where nothing sinister could ever occur yet. Beneath the surface, dark secrets were festering, hidden in the shadows of the family's facade. It was a cool autumn morning when the storm began to brew. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow on the exterior of the home. Inside, Robert Coleman sat at the kitchen table, stirring his coffee with a distracted air. His wife Emily moved about the kitchen preparing breakfast, her movements robotic, as if she had done the same thing for years without ever truly noticing the routine. Robert's eyes were fixed on his phone, the screen flickering with a message from Claire, the woman who had slowly entangled herself in his life, the woman with whom he had crossed the line, committing a betrayal that would unravel everything he held dear. Robert had never been an emotional man. He was steady, calculated, a businessman who had made a name for himself by staying just above the fray. His marriage to Emily, at least from the outside, was the epitome of normalcy. They had met in college, married young, and had a daughter, Lily, who had brought joy into their lives. Emily, with her soft demeanor and quiet charm, was the perfect wife. Together, they presented the image of a perfect family, one that would withstand anything life could throw at them. But that was before Claire. Claire had been Lily's teacher for 2 years, a smart, ambitious woman. Claire was young and full of energy. She had an air of mystery about her, one that drew people in. Robert had noticed her the first time she came to their home for a parent-teacher meeting. There was something about the way she looked at him, something sharp, knowing that piqued his interest. It wasn't long before they began communicating. Outside of school hours, first about schoolwork, then about more personal matters. It was harmless at first, just casual flirtations. But soon, the line between what was professional and what was personal began to blur. Emily had noticed the changes in Robert. He had become distracted, irritable. His late nights at the office increased, though she knew his business was not doing as well as he let on. Bills piled up, and the once secure financial future they had planned for seemed to slip through their fingers. But Robert had an answer for everything. He reassured her that it was just a rough patch, that everything would be fine soon. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tipping point came one night when Robert came home late, smelling faintly of perfume. Emily had confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. Robert had tried to brush it off, blaming it on the stress of work, but the unease in his eyes gave him away. Emily's suspicions grew, and it was then that she started piecing together the fragments of a story she hadn't wanted to see. The late-night phone calls, the secretive messages, the way Robert always seemed to distance himself when she brought up Claire's name. It was obvious now. The affair wasn't just an affair, it was a dangerous obsession, one that was slowly eating away at her family. Robert's feelings for Claire were complicated. He hadn't meant to fall in love with her. At first, it had been about the thrill to excitement of an affair, the feeling of power that came with having a younger woman desire him. But as the weeks passed, his emotions deepened. Claire became a drug he couldn't quit, someone who made him feel alive again in a way that Emily no longer did. But the more he fed this obsession, the more he lost control. And control was something Robert needed. It was what kept his life together, what kept his marriage intact, what allowed him to maintain his position in the community. Without control, everything he had worked for would collapse. That collapse began the night Claire came to their home uninvited, a visit that was supposed to be a final, innocent conversation. But when Claire stepped through the door, she found herself caught in the web of Robert's escalating madness. Robert had become unpredictable, and Claire, once certain of her power over him, now found herself fearful of what might happen next. She had started to regret the affair, but it was too late. The damage was done. Emily, who had spent the day with Lily, came home to find the tension in the air thicker than ever. Robert was pacing the hallway, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, his face pale. Claire was nowhere to be seen, but Emily could tell something had happened. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a premonition that had been growing. For weeks, Robert's eyes were wide, his lips pressed into a tight line. He looked at her, and for a moment, she thought she saw something break in his gaze, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. "What's going on, Robert?" Emily's voice was steady, but the anger simmering beneath the surface, that was unmistakable. He didn't respond right away. His silence was more telling than any words he could have spoken. "Where's Claire?" Emily's heart began to pound. The name felt like a curse on her lips. Robert finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "She's gone. I made a mistake, Emily. I've been a fool." The words cut through her like a knife. "A mistake?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You've been sleeping with her, Robert. That's not a mistake. That's betrayal." The truth hung heavy between them, but it was the sudden realization that Robert had never once considered her feelings, that her trust had been shattered in the most violent way, that tore at Emily. It was too much to bear. The power dynamics between them, those subtle manipulations that control Robert had always held, were collapsing before her eyes. And in that moment, Emily realized that her marriage was a house of cards. fragile and ready to tumble. What happened next was inevitable. The fight escalated, words were exchanged that could never be taken back, and Emily's rage, years of pent-up frustration and hurt, erupted. The emotions they had both been suppressing came crashing to the surface in an explosion of violence. Robert, in a panic, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The carefully crafted life they had built together crumbled in an instant. The aftermath was chaos. Robert stood in the center of the living room, breathing heavily, his face pale with shock. Emily, her hands shaking, stared at the scene before her husband, broken and defeated. She had never intended for it to go this far. She never wanted to destroy her family, but the pain of betrayal was more than she could handle. In that moment, all she could think of was the life she had lost, the family she thought she knew, the future she thought was secure. It was gone, irreparably shattered by a single mistake. Robert's desperation grew as he tried to cover up the truth. He claimed it was an accident, that things had spiraled out of control, but the weight of his lies became too much, and the panic that set in only deepened the hole he had dug for himself. Claire too was trapped. What had begun as a relationship fueled by power and desire had now become a dangerous game, one in which no one could win. Each of them was drowning in their own guilt, fear, and regret. The aftermath was more than just a ruined marriage, it was the unraveling of everything they had ever known. The truth would eventually come out, and when it did, it would change their lives forever. The community that had once admired Robert and Emily would never look at them the same way again. The whispers would begin, and the judgment would be swift and harsh. No one could escape the consequences of the choices they had made, and as the days passed, they would each be forced to confront the damage they had caused, and the truth of who they had become. The story was far from over. What followed would be a journey through guilt, loss, and the psychological toll of the crime. Justice would eventually be served, but at what cost? The lives of those involved were irreparably altered, and no one would come out of it unscathed. It was a reminder of how quickly a perfect life could be torn apart by obsession, betrayal, and the darkness that often lurks beneath the surface of even the most ordinary families.